So for my first project, I decided to dig a little deeper into No Child Left Behind. So just after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act became law in 1965, and No Child Left Behind was a more modern version of this. ESEA was one of the first times that the federal government became involved in educational policy, and that is still mainly a state and local function. So this image is from study.com, and most of my information is from there for this slide as well. The federal government is responsible for enacting this policy, and they really control the funding. The states controlled which tests were given and which standards those tests were based on, and then locally, school boards would decide on the specific curriculum that would be used to meet those standards. In 2002, President Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 into law, and it had an overwhelming amount of bipartisan support. The chief sponsors of the bill worked together across the aisle. Some were Democrats, some were Republicans, and they worked together. Those were their chief sponsors in the Senate and the House. No Child Left Behind was intended to ensure accountability and flexibility, as well as increased federal support for education. And its goal was to create a system that was more inclusive to all students, more responsive to those students' needs, and fair to all students. So ESEA came due for reauthorization in 2001, and it was renamed the No Child Left Behind Act. And it required states to have educational content standards, to test students on those standards, and to hold schools and districts accountable for students' test scores. Assessment results and state progress had to be broken out by poverty, race, ethnicity, disability, and limited English proficiency so that no child was left behind. Districts and schools that failed to make or exceed adequate yearly progress would be subject to improvement, corrective action, restructuring measures, and it would be aimed that they would get back on course so that they would meet those state standards. And students that were attending schools that were identified for improvement, corrective action, or restructuring would be given the opportunity to attend a different school, and the district would have to fund that transfer with up to 20% of their Title I funds. I liked this quote from George W. Bush on No Child Left Behind because it was very optimistic. There were a lot of arguments for No Child Left Behind. There was a disaggregation of data, and we had more specific data for specific groups. It was focused on serving and moving all students based on that data, and it pushed states to adapt measures for accountability, and the federal government became more responsible for improving public schools through funding. And funding was really their only card to play that they could use to improve schools. So there was bipartisan support for this, but there was also bipartisan pushback for this as well. So I found an article that compared Mike Pence and Bernie Sanders to one another because they both were against No Child Left Behind at the time of its signing, but for two very different reasons. Pence viewed the measure as a federal intrusion into educational policy, and he really felt that responsibility rested with the states. And Sanders was quoted as saying that so-called choice and high-stakes standardized testing would not improve our schools or enhance our children's ability to learn. So the goals of this were to get every child to grade level in reading and math by 2014. And it was kind of a difficult goal to reach. It infuriated teachers and administrators because it held every school to the same timeline. So it didn't account for progress that students had made if they were very low compared to what it gave the same expectations to every school. So it didn't matter if a child had begun the year 3 grade levels behind in reading, and then a teacher helped them make 2 years worth of progress by the end of the school year. According to the No Child Left Behind guidelines, that student was still a year below grade level. So the progress they made didn't matter because that student was still not at grade level. There were also other arguments against, like the fact that it narrows the curriculum, it moves away from departmentalization, it focuses on bubble kids as opposed to all kids, and those standards are unattainable for many schools. So, was No Child Left Behind successful? According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP, the score of an average 9-year-old inclined up only 4 points in reading during the 3 decades prior to No Child Left Behind. So that's approximately a gain of 0.1 points per year. To contrast that, in 1999, all the way up to 2012, 9-year-olds have gained 9 points in reading, which is an average of 7 times as much annual growth. And for 13-year-olds, reading scores increased the same amount through 1999 to 2012 as they did from 1971 to 1999. So the same gains occurred in less than half of the before No Child Left Behind time frame. And in math, students made progress in the 80s, but by the 90s, that growth plateaued. So the average 9-year-old in 1990 scored a 230 on the NAEP in math, and that number was up only 2 points in 1999. And that score significantly increased in the No Child Left Behind era. It went up by to gain a full point per year. And it's similar for 13-year-olds in math, who had an increase of 9 points in a dozen years. And a study from the National Bureau of Educational Research found there was no adverse impact on student performance in science after the NCLB accountability measures were put into place. So even though No Child Left Behind focused on reading and math scores and forced schools to focus on math and reading, it appears through that study from the National Bureau of Educational Research that it did not have any adverse impacts on their science scores. So there was a significant decrease in the racial gap in American students. African American 9-year-old students improved by 20 points, which is nearly 2 points a year and double the improvement made by white students of the same age. And Hispanic 9-year-olds gained 15 points since No Child Left Behind was enacted. The gap between white and African American 9-year-olds was reduced from 35 points to 23 points. That means there's a 1 point decrease in the gap every year after decades of persistence. And among 13-year-olds, white students gained 3 points, but African American students gained 9 points, and Hispanic students gained 5, which reduces the gap in 13-year-olds from 29 to 23. If you take a look at those math scores, there were gains there as well. 9-year-old white students gained about 13 points from 1999 to 2012, and African American students of the same age improved by 15 points, and Hispanic students gained 21 points, which is a ridiculous increase. It's amazing. The gap between white and Hispanic 9-year-olds was reduced by 8 points in a dozen years. 65% of African American fourth graders were below basic math in 2000, and by 2013, that number was reduced to 34%. And among Hispanic students, fourth graders went from 59% to 27% below basic in math. 13-year-olds, among 13-year-olds, white students gained 10 points between 1999 and 2012, and African American students gained 13 points, and Hispanic students improved 12 points. So the gains for students with disabilities is more difficult to track because the NAEP data isn't really available prior to 2004. So it's difficult to know where they stood before No Child Left Behind was enacted. But in the short time between 2004 and 2012, students with disabilities that were 9 years old scored 5 points higher on grading and 7 points higher on math. And 13-year-old students gained 8 points in reading and 6 points in math. So clearly more needs to be done to address the needs of students with disabilities, but this was the first time that we were able to identify the gaps and see that scores are moving in the right direction. And the success of No Child Left Behind for English language learners is not as clear-cut. There are many flaws in the types of assessments used for those groups. So the data that we do have does show growth. Fourth grade ELL students gained 20 points in reading between 2000 and 2013. So some conclusions. Obviously, there were some numerous negatives, but also some significant positives for No Child Left Behind. So there was a loss of state control over schools, and the failing schools just continued to get worse. I found an article that discussed some issues in North Carolina's public schools. And this is a quote from Donna Brown, who is the director of federal program monitoring and support for North Carolina public schools. She said, "When I came to the department in 2004, there were 9 schools in the state that identified for some level of improvement sanction. And by 2008, there were 521. So she went from 9 schools to 521 schools. That 521 is nearly half the schools in the state that received those federal Title I dollars. After 2 years of failing to make progress, a school had to start offering students the right to transfer to a better school. But the problem with letting students transfer is that you aren't really doing anything to address the needs of that school that's struggling. So those schools that were failing tended to just continue to get worse and worse. So if schools failed to make adequate yearly progress, they were required to pay for tutoring services as well, and they would have to choose from a list of corrective actions, which could include changing curriculum entirely or even lengthening the school day. So that's a big negative as well, just that those poorly funded, difficult schools to be in really just continue to get worse. Restructuring plans could even include firing teachers and changing the public school to a charter school, or even handling total control of the school over to the state. Those restructuring plans, however, were actually somewhat successful in various areas. I found one study that showed that teacher satisfaction increased after a restructuring plan was set in place. And the restructuring plans that showed teacher satisfaction were actually ones where the first thing that the restructuring did was replace a principal and put a new principal in place that had a legitimate plan for improving the district. So some other positives about No Child Left Behind are the significant improvement in the disaggregated data. That's so important to know how various groups of students are doing. And we also know that it improved the racial gap in public schools, specifically with African American and Hispanic students. So I think that it's important to remember that while No Child Left Behind had its significant issues, as we continue to update it and change it, hopefully it also continues to improve our schools and our students as well. These are my sources that I used for this project. Two of them are from our module from last week, and the other four are ones that I found on my own, and they are of various different websites, the Washington Post and NPR included, as well as ed.gov.